Welcome. In this video, I will address critical thinking within the context of source analysis. You've probably heard the term critical thinking before, but do you know what it means? Could you define the term for another student right now? I'll offer my definition of critical thinking, which captures the gestalt from the philosophers of the last 2 millennia. Now, source analysis is relatively easy to understand. The challenge arises in putting source analysis into practice, but I'll offer you advice that makes the job a little bit easier. If you're willing to watch this video through to the end, I'll offer you tips that make your research activities not only easier, but better. You might even earn higher grades on your research projects. Let's get started. Here I'm displaying the PDF file for an article about critical thinking. It's primarily directed toward educators, but I think it can be useful for a student also. Now, I ask you to look past some of the compositional errors that are in this paper. The authors are probably not native English speakers. So let's put on our critical thinking hats and look past the errors in the use of English and try to understand the arguments that the authors present. In the introduction, the authors address thinking as the ultimate goal of training. It's a crucial component of the educational process. Now, I would doubt that any of us would disagree with that one of the benefits of participating in education is learning to think more clearly. It's not just knowing facts and being able to acquire particular mechanical skills. Education is also about learning to know what skill to apply and when to apply it. It's about knowing how to evaluate the quality of some object or some process. The authors also state the goal of educational systems is educated people who are independent and can think effectively. All right, so what does it mean to think effectively? So does that mean quickly? Does it mean using the fewest resources? Probably not. That would be thinking efficiently, because there's a distinction between efficient and effective. Effective is more about a quality of production. So philosophers such as Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle regarded critical thinking as the ability to ask questions, to test, to think about ideas and values. Okay. I've addressed in prior videos the need to create a research question before embarking on a research project. Is that critical thinking? It sure is. The ability to form a question is part of critical thinking because in asking the question, one has to first recognize what is missing. What knowledge is absent? To test and to think about ideas and values is important to the thinking process. It's particularly important to the critical thinking process. The authors continue, another reason of independent and think effectively is that each researcher defines it with regard to his own understanding and research needs. Now, getting past the errors in English composition, the authors are proposing that the thought process that one employs is or needs to be appropriate for the purpose to which the thought is being applied, or the thought process is being applied. If I am evaluating the quality of this paper here that I'm showing to you, then I could make the judgment that these authors are not using standard American English. But does that necessarily mean that the information contained within the document is not or should be ignored? Sure, it's not written in standard American English. There are compositional errors. But that doesn't mean I should ignore the general arguments that the authors are attempting to present. It's as if when I lived in Europe, if I went into the store and used my really bad schoolboy German, should the customer service people ignore my request for assistance? That would be an inappropriate response. Now, they may have difficulty in understanding me, but does that make my request any less valid, any less important? So in this document, a critical thinking skill should be to recognize that these are probably not native English speakers, but to try to read more deeply to understand what the authors are attempting to say. On the next page, under the definitions and theories of critical thinking that are based in philosophy, I highlighted a statement: informal logic supports accurate theoretical foundations for critical thinking, with little emphasis on the arguments and evidence. So, the clarification the authors are attempting to make here is informally, in colloquial use, logic doesn't depend necessarily on the clear and precise identification of the arguments or the evidence in defense of the arguments. And that's what I'm asking you to do with this paper, is to look past how the arguments are presented and seek to understand what the arguments are and make a fair judgment of the quality of the arguments in the paper. In the next paragraph, Annis believed that critical thinking is a rational and reflexive thinking, focusing on beliefs and decisions. I agree with that. I do think that critical thinking is rational. I'm not quite sure what Annis meant by reflexive thinking, but I do agree that critical thinking is based on a recognition of one's beliefs and the decisions that one has made or will be making. So, let me offer my definition of critical thinking. I've been telling students for many years something to the effect that critical thinking is the thought process that requires recognition of one's own biases and preferences so as to minimize their effect on the application of logic in the evaluation of data that's being considered. Let me say that again. Critical thinking is the recognition of one's own biases and preferences so that their effect on the application of logic is mitigated when considering data before one. And this is really hard. For me, my biases are part of who I am. They're part of the way I perceive the world. Can I recognize those biases so that they don't cloud the judgments that I have of the data that I'm reviewing? Okay, for many years, I've integrated into my courses, either I've taught a full course on, or I've integrated a portion of how to write well into a course that I'm teaching. So to me, the ability to write well is a skill that I want college students to acquire. In reading this paper, the one I'm showing you on the screen, if a student were to submit this to me for a grade in a class, I would have to reduce the grade because of the compositional errors that are in the paper. But good critical thinking, when I'm seeking to understand what these authors are arguing, requires me to look past that bias that I have, to constantly critique student writing and to seek to understand what authors are attempting to report in their works. Reading further in this paper, I come upon a section, Definitions and Theories of Critical Thinking, that are based on psychology. The authors wrote, while philosophers focus on the nature and quality of critical thinking as a product, psychologists emphasize cognitive processes, components, and applications used to examine practical problems. And I agree with this statement. I think it's important in developing critical thinking skills that students not just focus on what are the qualities of good critical thinking, but how can good critical thinking be done in practice? What should be applied? What are the processes that can be used to demonstrate critical thinking? And that's why in my definition for critical thinking, I use the phrase to recognize the biases and preferences that one has. It's in recognizing what my frame, my lens that I'm using to evaluate material before me, and what color does my lens add to the evaluation of the material before me. In the next section, I highlighted a statement that I think is vital. The essence of critical thinking is suspended judgment. And this is important. When seeking to understand any phenomenon, one must hold in abeyance any judgment of the quality or application or usefulness or any judgment of the phenomenon until the phenomenon is understood. Then, once understood, one may make a judgment of its quality, of its application to a particular purpose, or its suitability to a particular purpose, and how it may be applied to that purpose. That's where source analysis comes in evaluating the quality of the information, or I should say the quality of the data presented in a sourced document. An adroit researcher can make an informed judgment as to how the data may be used to create information that serves the researcher's needs. Further on in the same section, the literature review section of this paper, is a statement from Bloom in that, or I shouldn't say a statement, it's argument presented by Bloom that the number of abilities and skills under each of their taxonomy levels, for example, under analysis, Bloom and his colleagues listed the ability to recognize unstated assumptions. Now, this is really important. What is left unsaid in an argument? And why was it left unsaid? Why was the argument presented to the reader in a form that assumed that the reader would hold a particular perspective? This comes up in political discourse frequently. Politicians seek to gain agreement from constituents and from other politicians, and they often speak in a manner that presents unstated assumptions about the listener or the reader or the receiver's perceptions. Bloom and colleagues went on to say, the skill in distinguishing facts from hypotheses is also important. Okay, a fact is something that's empirically true. A hypothesis is a presumption of truthfulness or presumption of untruthfulness is how hypotheses are sometimes stated. But in either regard, a hypothesis is not a truth. It's a statement about, is it true or is it not true? It being a phenomenon. Now, McPeck described critical thinking as the appropriate use of reflective skepticism within the problem area under consideration. I don't disagree with this definition of critical thinking. Critical thinking does require us to be skeptical. We cannot accept data prima facie as being true. We must kind of hold it up and look at all sides of it and make an analysis that allows us to choose whether we accept or reject the data's truthfulness or assumption of truthfulness. Now, here are a summary of the definitions of critical thinking that were presented in this literature review. Socrates would define critical thinking as reasoning debate, or the process of asking critical questions. Dewey would describe critical thinking as ongoing review of ideas and beliefs and reasoning to defeat them. Kant would describe critical thinking as liberal thinking, knowledge and responsibility for making decision with regard to the measure of performance. McPeck would describe critical thinking as reflexive suspicion, or I think it's better stated, reflexive skepticism. I can be skeptical without being suspicious. Enos would describe critical thinking as correct evaluation of ideas and reflexive thinking about what we believe and what we do. Now that captures one of the elements of my definition of critical thinking, the need to recognize the biases and preferences that I have so that I don't allow them to affect my ability to fairly be critical about data that I acquire. Here is a summary of critical thinking skills. I'm all in the same paper here. To begin with, analysis of the data, reasoning about the data, inference for any particular suitability for purpose, comparing data from multiple sources. Remember, data is a plural word. Formulating a hypothesis, possibly, particularly in a quantitative study. A study that uses a statistical analysis of data will require the forming of a hypothesis that is then tested. Now, often the hypothesis is phrased in the negative. It's called a null hypothesis, and the null hypothesis is tested for some degree of statistical significance. Synthesizing knowledge and creating new ideas, testing the data that's been acquired and how well it fits with the new ideas, and then reaching a conclusion. Now, what's important about critical thinking is that reasonable people can reach different conclusions based on the same starting data. And that's because individually, researchers have different skills and abilities and perceptions and biases and preferences. To the degree that we can minimize the external influences on our thinking, the more clear, maybe the more precise, maybe the more unfettered of data analysis we can create. And this is really hard. Thinking critically, being fair, being honest is difficult because by nature, most of us like to receive data that is in concordance with or agrees with the perceptions and the biases that we already hold. Which, by the way, is why I caution students, particularly undergraduate students, that when conducting research, don't come up with a conclusion and then seek to find data in support of that conclusion. Almost regardless of what your conclusion is, you will find, or you should be able to find, some expert that offers data in support of that conclusion. That doesn't mean that's the dominant preference among experts. For example, if you want data that proves the world is flat rather than roughly spherical, you'll find scientists who report that. Doesn't mean the world's flat. Look, I was a pilot. I have seen the curvature of the Earth with my own eyes. I know the Earth is not flat on a total planetary level. Sure, is it flat in my backyard? Yeah. But is it flat if I were to go out 100 miles? Not so much. There's some curvature to the globe there. I like this diagram about attitudes toward critical thinking. Sure, during research, we search for facts. Now, I often don't use the word fact because in the last few years, at least here in the United States, the word fact has taken on a somewhat negative connotation. So instead I say search for data. Be curious. Maintain a skeptical perception. Be doubtful about the truthfulness of the data under review. Show a degree of cognitive maturity. Don't become emotionally wrapped up in the data that you acquire. Always step back one level and be skeptical of data that you're reviewing. But on the other hand, be confident in your own abilities to make an analysis, to make an evaluation of the data you're reviewing. Integrate the data that you acquire from multiple sources and seek to understand how the data fit together. And always keep an open mind. As new data become available, be willing to change your judgments. At the time of the recording of this video, the monkeypox virus is making inroads into Western populations. And I've been cautioning my friends. In fact, it came up at a dinner conversation over the weekend. I said, look, the monkeypox is not something to worry about as we worried about the SARS-CoV-2 virus over the last few years, but it is something to be aware of from a population health, from a public health circumstance. This is a virus that is relatively transmissible from skin-to-skin contact and even possibly through respiratory droplets. It is a virus that can infect people fairly easily, not as much as the coronavirus, but just being in the presence of someone else that's breathing in our direction could allow us to become infected, as well as prolonged skin-to-skin contact can transmit the virus. To an adult, not a big deal. Most of us are not at risk of serious complications from this virus, but it can kill children relatively quickly. So we need to protect ourselves so that we protect our households. And if we don't have children in our homes anymore, then we still need to protect our nieces, our nephews, our grandchildren. They are the population that's at risk for serious complications from this virus. 2 months ago, I didn't know what the monkeypox was. I would have said my primary concern, actually my only viral concern at that moment would have been the coronavirus, and maybe in the back of my mind I'm thinking about the influenza virus coming again in the fall. But now I've had to add monkeypox to my health radar. Am I worried about it? No. Am I aware of it? Am I following it in the news? Yes. I'm keeping an open mind as new data comes in front of me. So, how do critical thinking and source analysis fit together? Why is the combination of these two skills so important to academic success? Well, I chose this document for the particular reason that I think the authors are not native English speakers, and I frequently either teach classes in academic writing or integrate elements of academic writing instruction into the courses that I'm teaching. And I'm prone to having a bias against authors that don't use English well. Okay, I know that's one of my biases. So I wish to demonstrate the use of critical thinking in the analysis of the data presented in that paper. And did the authors do what I think is a reasonably good job in presenting their arguments? Yes, they did. They integrated data as far back as Socrates with current data. They integrated data from philosophy with data from psychology. Did they use graphical elements as well as textual elements to convey their arguments? I think that's a good way of conveying information, and I should look past the errors that they made in syntax and grammar. That's my analysis of the quality of that sourced data. Critical thinking requires recognizing our biases, our prejudices, our preferences, and not allowing them to color the judgments that we make of data in front of us. Source analysis requires us to not accept data prima facie, to ask, from where did it come? Who said it? What are that person or person's qualifications? Did they present the information or the data in a reputable form? Or, teach you a new word, a reputable forum. Sure, these authors published their work in an academic journal. Their article was peer-reviewed prior to publication, so it's not like they just wrote it themselves and posted it to a website for all to read. I encourage you to practice thinking critically. Be skeptical. Don't accept data prima facie. Ask, from where did it come? Ask, says who? Expect the presentation of data to persuade you to accept the claims that are made in the papers. And constantly seek to evaluate the quality of the sources from which you acquire your data. Just because something's published in a peer-reviewed journal doesn't mean the data is accurate. There have been plenty examples of retracted papers that made it through the review process, were published, and then later the data were found to be false or inappropriate or the judgments incorrect. Just be careful. Be skeptical. Don't accept things prima facie. Ask from where the data came. Why were they presented in the order that they were? Who presented them? Kind of pick away at the data that you have and don't assume it to be a true or even appropriate to your current research needs. Think about the data. Analyze it. I wish you the absolute best in all of your research projects, and I recognize that critical thinking and source analysis are both difficult practices. But go forth and practice them so that you can improve your skills at doing them. I wish you good luck in all of your research. I look forward to seeing you in a future video. Bye for now.